Paul had written a previous letter. He'd written 1 Corinthians, and then he had sent Timothy over to Corinth as his personal representative to talk to people, to see what was going on there. Timothy's report was not good. Corinth, the church there, was struggling. They were struggling with issues of sexual immorality. They were still struggling with other kinds of things, with their beliefs, with their practices. So Paul put all of his other plans to the side, and he went to visit Corinth personally. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, he describes that visit as painful. Paul does not usually describe his experiences as painful. So this must indeed have been a very difficult conversation with a church that was struggling with issues of immorality and communion and marriage and all of the things that we have already talked about. Paul had that painful visit and returned back to Ephesus, where he tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, he wrote another letter. This one he referred to as a tearful letter. So he wrote a previous letter, then he wrote 1 Corinthians. Now he has written a tearful letter. And he told people that this letter was not intended to be a punishment. It was not intended to be discipline. It was intended to show his love. It was intended to help with their obedience. In this tearful letter and in this painful visit, Paul loved the church in Corinth, and he loved the people, and he desperately wanted them to live rightly before God. That was the point of all of his ministry with Corinth. Well, things were apparently getting a little bit better, and Paul then wrote 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians now, Paul has three primary issues. One, he wanted to counter false teaching. Apparently, one of the things that was happening in Corinth during all of this time was that there were teachers coming in teaching something other than the gospel Paul had brought. And they were confusing people. Again, remember, these are new believers. The church was brand new, not just the church in Corinth, but the church in the world. This is just about 20 years after Christ's death and resurrection. There was no history of churches. There were no denominations to help. There were no seminaries to train people. They were all learning this new, and the church in Corinth was struggling. So Paul wrote to help correct and counter the false teaching that was happening. And he reminded them of what he had already taught and clearly said, if anyone teaches other than what I'm teaching, they are not teaching truly. Well, his next point was about the offering. So he taught about generosity. And he taught about the need for the church to be generous, for people to give freely, joyfully, and reminded them specifically of the offering. And he said, when I come and visit you next, I'm going to want to collect the offering, and we're going to send that offering back to Jerusalem, and you're going to want to be generous in that offering. So he talked about false teachers. He talked about generosity in the offering. And then he spent a large part of this letter defending himself. Paul does not do that often, but apparently the teachers there, these false teachers, not only were teaching false gospel and wrong doctrine, they were teaching that there was something wrong with Paul, that Paul was only teaching for the money, or that Paul was false teaching himself. And so Paul spent considerable time in 2 Corinthians defending his teaching and his person and his character and his calling from God. So as we read through 2 Corinthians, we discover an argument against false teaching. We discover the discussion of why we should be generous as followers of Christ, and we learn more about Paul and the calling that God had placed on Paul's life. And, by the way, apparently the church had followed his instructions, and they had expelled the man who had been living in sexual immorality. So one of his messages is the point of expelling someone from church is not to never talk to them again. It's to remind people that they need to turn back to Christ. They need to ask for forgiveness. They need to repent. So one key teaching of Paul is when someone does repent, we forgive them and we welcome them back. And Paul said, I trust you, church, if he has repented and you have forgiven him and welcomed him back, so do I. Which was a great leadership example of Paul trusting that they were going to do the right thing and supporting their decision in that right thing. Well, Paul had been traveling while he wrote this letter. He was somewhere in the Roman province of Macedonia when he wrote the letter to the 2 Corinthians. And it would have been somewhere early in the year 54, just to put some time frame on this. He continues to travel around that part of the Roman world and then eventually revisits Corinth. So he had written the previous letter, he'd written 1 Corinthians, he'd written a tearful letter and had a painful visit. Then finally he writes the letter 2 Corinthians, after which he returns and visits Corinth again, this time apparently under much happier circumstances. And it's in that visit, after 2 Corinthians was written, that in Corinth he wrote a letter to the Romans. And we'll pick up with the letter to the Romans in our next class.